Welcome to Hiraeth, the home of modern Welsh politics. Wales has been to the polls. Well, 17% of us have. In all the weekend-long coverage of elections in Wales and England, one thing has rarely been commented on, and that is the depressingly low turnout. This was especially the case in Wales. Without Senedd or local elections to buttress turnout, only 17% of eligible voters in Wales turned out to vote for our police and crime commissioners. But we'll talk about this, the reaction to local elections in England, Senedd anniversaries and more in this episode, where me and Rich are joined by Councillor Joe Carter, the Welsh Liberal Democrat Councillor for Pentwyn and Senedd in Cardiff. Hello, Joe. And Lila Haynes, independent researcher, author, and, interestingly for the purposes of this episode, a Senedd staffer at the beginning of devolution in 1999. Hello, Lila. Right, so let's start in Wales, the Police and Crime Commissioner elections. Now, Rich, me and you have talked a little bit about this, haven't we? This change of electoral systems with the previous supplementary vote being scrapped in favour of first past the post. Because we did an episode recently on elections in London, and we commented on the fact that basically this change had happened and nobody seemed to be kicking up much of fuss. Why do you think this change happened, Rich, and why do you think there was surprisingly little opposition to it?
There was surprisingly little opposition to it because no one cares. Let's put that at the top. This is the Police and Crime Commissioner elections after all. And not just that, the Welsh Police and Crime Commissioner elections, which are the periphery of the England and Wales policing service. As anyone who has followed my occasional contributions to the pod over the last year or so have always been slightly mystified that there has been so much of a fuss in Wales about the change of the voting system and people calling for referendums and various other things to give some kind of mandate for it to happen. But the switch to first past the post for PCCs and also the mayoralties in England, combined, of course, with the addition of requirements for voter ID, just unilaterally imposed by the UK government. No one seemed to bat an eyelid at that, and it doesn't seem to have triggered any kind of complaints at all. Now, of course, what we have, the results that came in last week have vouched for the fact that not only does no one really care about this, but it doesn't matter. Apparently, you can change the voting system, and it doesn't seem to make a blind bit of difference either, because we came back with exactly the same results as we went into them. PCCs, PCC elections, I would love to say that there was a genuine question of democracy about it, but I don't even think it reaches that level. I think the question is really how long until they're scrapped and replaced with something better in the Welsh context. And this is, of course, specifically a Welsh problem because, unlike in England, unlike in Scotland, and unlike in Northern Ireland, Wales does not have control of its own police service. And so, let's hope it's the last time we have to go through this farce. Sorry, so negative.
We'll get cheerier now, I'm sure. We'll get really cheerier now. Lila, do you agree? Why do you think we had such abysmal turnout in Wales? Is it simply because nobody cares about police and crime commissioner elections?
I think they barely know about it, frankly. And I have been voting for more than half a century. And for the first time in my life, I almost didn't bother this year for PCCs. I forgot to post my postal vote till almost the last minute, and I went, it's raining. Do I care? Oh, well, let's just do it. I've already filled the form in. But I was quite shocked at myself, really, because I am such a firm believer in democracy and electoral democracy, and I almost didn't bother. So what does that tell us about how little people care about that particular issue, about that particular election? I fear that people who are perhaps not as interested as we four on this podcast are, might have not even bothered to fill the form in.
Joe, as the Lib Dems did stand in all four of the PCC elections in Wales, but the party is not in favour of the role. Am I right in that understanding?
That's correct. We've never we've never been in favour of the role, and the first elections, we didn't stand at all, and we have stood since, and that's been thrown back at us on the doorstep. People saying, "Why should we vote for you if you don't believe in the role?" And we've explained that is the party position, and that just because we don't believe in it, we would still try to make the best of it. And we don't believe in council tax. We always believe in a more progressive taxation system, but we still have to abide by those rules when you run a council. That is a difficult situation we're all in, but there was a sense of pessimism about this election, about what's the point, and I think we didn't help that necessarily as politicians. I don't think there were many councillors, many activists across the nation who were particularly excited about the election, and there was a distinct lack. I can certainly comment on Cardiff, a distinct lack of anyone putting up any boards or posters in people's houses saying, championing the cause of the candidates. And many of us were on the doorstep, but and certainly in our case, and I very much suspect this for the other parties as well, in reality, we were mainly promoting our parliamentary candidates for the upcoming general election rather than our police and crime commissioner election candidates. And in the week before the election, I think we sort of switched, and certainly I had quite a few useful conversations about it. And actually, I was quite positively surprised by how many people were actively asking me about that election when I was there holding up a leaflet talking about my parliamentary candidates, but not even mentioning our commissioner candidates. So we're all guilty as politicians of not talking about this election enough, and possibly if we had done, it might have increased turnout a bit. But in reality, the public out there don't know what the role does. There's a perception about these roles being a graveyard for retired politicians, and that's clearly going to change a bit now because we've got a younger cohort of commissioners that are elected, and that's possibly more a South Wales perception anyway. There's a perception all this time on, people not knowing what they're for and what they're there to do, despite the fact this is in reality a very powerful role in the right hands.
Yeah, I was going to say, Joe, I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. I was going to say, I mean, how can people not know much about the role after such stellar performance in the role by the outgoing police and crime commissioners in South Wales and South East Wales in Gwent? It's been, they've really set the world alight with their clarity of thought and, real deep integrity as they make sure that the police get challenged internally, Yeah, anyway, let's move on. Matthew, let's talk a little bit about how the political parties have responded to the victories. I was reading with some entertainment a very interesting piece by Martin Shipton in nation.cymru earlier today, who dug up some interesting quotes from the parliamentary debate about the introduction of PCCs, including very stern words against them from the Rhondda's Chris Bryant. I haven't heard that many people from the Labour Party criticising the existence of the roles in light of winning 3 of the 4 seats in Wales. Any thoughts about why that might be?
Well, yes, let's talk about the results for those who haven't been paying attention. And, there's 83% of the voting populace that hasn't necessarily paid attention, so we'll go from there. Labour did win 3 out of the 4 police and crime commissioner elections in Wales, with David Llewellyn of Plaid Cymru winning the Dyfed Powys election. Historically, Rich, the Labour Party's position on police and crime commissioners in Wales was always much like the Liberal Democrats, to abolish the position of police and crime commissioners. I remember in the 2016 cohort of police and crime commissioners, there was only one police and crime commissioner in Wales who didn't want to see the roles abolished. I will leave it to the imagination of those listening to work out who that was. But my understanding, and I'm sure someone will correct me when hearing this, is the position of the Welsh Labour Party still remains to abolish the roles of police and crime commissioners. And, of course, see the devolution of policing and justice to the Senedd. But again, we know there are certain politicians who disagree on that now, don't we?
Christopher Bryant could not be contacted for comment.
Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, I think that's the ideal situation, right? Is that the roles are abolished in Wales, and we have whether it's a single police force or whether it's 4 police forces, but managed in the Senedd by a justice minister or cabinet secretary for justice, as we are now using cabinet secretary terms. But I think that's the ideal scenario. We'll just have to wait and see what happens when Labour win the general election, whenever that may be.
In the friendliest and most hiraeth cymreidly way, challenge your idea that that's the best outcome for future governance of the police. I think that ultimately we just need to have some kind of clearer regional distribution of public services and local accountability some way or another. The problem is that we've got overlapping maps of health, policing, fire, most other public services currently run by local authorities, and of course, you know, the historic counties and representation of the Crown, which is crucial to the functioning of a modern democracy in Wales. I suppose the question it's a philosophical one that I don't have an answer to, but I'm really curious to know the thoughts of our guests today about this, and of course yours, Matt. Is at what point does an election become illegitimate? You know, if you have, as you had in some parts of Wales, barely 10% of the electorate voting for, you know, these roles, can we call that a legitimate election?
I think it's worth emphasising at this point, Rich, that the turnout this time was actually higher than the last time that we had standalone police and crime commissioner elections in Wales. Just higher.
Which does really suggest that people have not cared at any point about it, or have never been sufficiently well informed by those who ought to be doing that about why it's important. And maybe that's because they can't come up with a really good answer. And what I've been thinking in the last few days is Wales is a really small country, admittedly with geographical challenges that need to be considered. So what are you trying to achieve by having police and crime commissioners in the first place, since that's what we're looking at the moment? But what are we trying to achieve in having several police areas? You know, it's a small enough country to have one integrated cooperative sort of police system, if you had the powers to bring that about, which of course Wales can't at the moment. Or can it? That's something I'm not sure about. Could that happen? Could the police services be united in one Welsh? You know, I almost said corporation, so I don't mean that.
In the way that Police Scotland was formed from the former things, it could do, but of course it would require the UK Home Secretary to, you know, not only either acquiesce or lead on that conversation, and that seems quite unlikely the way things have gone. But it's not impossible. So
if Labour in Wales would like to see the police commissioners abolished, can we infer from that Labour in London, Labour in Britain, would also like to do that? I think I've heard some leading members of Labour say they favoured it. And if so, where on the list of priorities would it be for the next government, which is highly likely to be Labour?
I think the challenge there is that, like any election, now that Labour have done so well in the police and crime commission elections in England, and there certainly are this same with these metro mayors, and now that you have people in those posts, then obviously Turkeys aren't going to vote for Christmas, and you can see the reluctance to go down that route. What I've often thought is fascinating is that it was obviously very much a Cameronite idea going for these police and crime commission elections, but as time's gone on, clearly they've got bored of that in England as well. Now going down the metro mayor route, if you have a metro mayor, even if your area is not actually a metro, you can suddenly get rid of your police and crime commission election. You get a mayor instead, which has a greater profile and therefore greater turnout, I understand as well, and get rid of that duplication of effort. But it all seems very, very, very uncertain and very unclear. But this is a challenge, I suppose, between the difference between Welsh Labour policy versus UK Labour policy and degrees of importance, because I struggle to see this resonating largely in UK Labour thinking, when there's obviously so many other UK things we're taking on. And as much as Nielsen's podcasts and many, I think, of the Welsh Labour group in the Senedd would like to see this decision being taken in Wales by a Welsh government, that seems to be very much the opposite viewpoint for Welsh Labour MPs. So sadly, feel we are going to be stuck with this system for quite some time, even though it's deeply unpopular across all parties in Wales.
Like you said, whilst the Senedd group are big fans of the devolution of justice, as we've seen from numerous comments and slight changes in position from the Welsh Labour MPs, it's pretty clear that there's no great appetite there to see the devolution of justice and policing. And as such, powers over whether the PCCs remain in place or not is likely very much to be a UK Labour decision, UK government decision. And I can't see it being high up on their list of priorities when they enter Downing Street in a few months' time.
That's a second-term project, Matthew. It's a second term. of the Labour government project. I just want to throw this in at the end of this conversation about PCCs. Something that maybe particularly, Joe, you might have some insight on, as someone who's campaigned in local elections a lot. Is there also a danger of election fatigue with the public, in that, people are asked to vote for the National Parliament in Wales, the Union Parliament in London, and of course local authority elections, all of which run on different cycles, although there is no, of course, cycle anymore for UK government or UK Parliament elections. RIP Fixed Term Parliament Act. Does that mean that there's no break from electoral cycles?
I think there is a challenge of a risk of election fatigue, clearly. But actually, if you look at the Welsh electoral cycles recently, in comparison with large parts of England, we've had significantly less elections. So large parts of England would have elections every year for the local areas, particularly if they're a particularly rural area. And even the urban areas, the likes of Greater Manchester, you'd be looking at a council election 3 out of 4 years, a mayoral election on the 4th year, plus a general election, which will come whenever the Prime Minister now decides it. So actually, we've had significantly less elections in Wales, arguably because of that. I think the challenge is probably the fatigue of councillors and general activists, because it's a really hard election to motivate people for. And I had someone said to me on doorstep this last week, well, I'm not going to vote because because the candidates haven't come knocking on my door. And I said, well, hang on. I said, well, this is a massive area. I mean, the idea that a police and crime commissioner might happen to knock on your door, when actually the population of South Wales is so vast. I mean, that's obviously something you aspire for a general election. Your candidate will get around everywhere. But actually, in a police and crime commission election, the areas are so large that's just not going to happen. So I think motivating activists, motivating members, motivating even your councillor base to do stuff in an election like that is very different. It's very difficult, and there isn't even, I suppose, a limited element of patronage, I suppose, with the very, very limited thinking about assistant commissioners. But apart from that, many councillors on the ground for any party are going to say, what's the benefit of this election? So I think the fatigue of councillors and activists is probably greater than the electorate in this regard. So actually, many people I spoke to are quite excited about the prospect of a UK general election when it comes. Probably more excited than many activists, thinking we don't want our Christmas ruined. Let's just get it done in the summer instead. Actually, they would, I think the electorate wouldn't mind, because they see it as being very important.
Before we leave PCCs alone, I just wanted to, we've talked a lot about percentages, but I just want to show you the differences in raw numbers between what happens in this PCC election, where it takes place by itself, and when the last PCC elections took place at the same time as the previous Senedd election. So we'll just take South Wales as an example here. So in 2021, Alan Michael was elected Police and Crime Commissioner for South Wales with a total number of votes of 225,463. And this time in South Wales, Central Emma Walls received a total of 73,128 votes. So it is quite a difference when this election takes place by itself rather than with something else.
I think we've given the PCC elections more time than they're due anyway.
Probably more time than they got in the entire month-long build-up to the contest, really.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So I think we're done with them. Shall we move on, Matthew, to talk about the English local elections, or as the BBC would describe them, the England and Wales local elections? What's been the party's response to the results? I think specifically thinking about the key general election matchup between the Conservatives and the Labour Party in terms of the narratives that have come out.
Yeah, I think the Labour Party are going to be over the moon after this weekend. Not only did you see them win hundreds and hundreds more councillors, the big victory in the West Midlands mayoralty, which has been, was being briefed all weekend that the Tories were going to hold on, much like they did in Tees Valley. But not only are these key victories great, winning councils like Hartlepool and Redditch, making big gains in places like Plymouth and Swindon, key sort of battleground areas for the next general election. But also some of the swings in areas that they didn't win, that is really great for the Labour Party. You look at Tees Valley, again, there was a swing from the Conservatives to Labour of 17%. Now that would be enough of a swing to win every seat in the Tees Valley for Labour at the next general election. So I think they're thinking things can only get better, is the saying that they often use. But I think we've missed a lot from the analysis that happened this weekend, which is the Blackpool South by-election, where there was a 23% swing from the Conservatives to Labour, which, like I said the other day, would be incredible, would be groundbreaking if it hadn't already happened about 5 or 6 times this parliamentary term. So there are huge smiles on people's faces and the Labour Party, and that's why they're desperately calling for a general election. From the conversations I've had with Conservative friends of mine, they are not particularly so eager for that contest to occur. They are very, very upset by the losses of people like Andy Street in the West Midlands. They think they could have picked better candidates in places like London that may have given them a better result. There's an awful lot of people worried about just how badly the Conservatives might lose in that general election. And you can only see that through what's being briefed over the course of the weekend, Rich. Everyone's saying that, these results will show a hung parliament. And then 10 minutes later, polls will be released showing a Labour lead of 25 points. So it's a spin operation now. And I think, we've all got people we think perform particularly well over an election weekend, and most of the time they tend to be candidates. But for me, the best performers this entire weekend have been Conservative Party spinners, just trying to build this narrative around how Labour haven't hit their targets, which I think is very clear from everyone to see just how big the gap is between the two main parties now.
Well, fascinating as always, Matthew, but you are on the naughty step for invoking D. Reeb and Tony Blair in 1997. So over to you, Joe. We didn't mention there, of course, the Liberal Democrats. Liberal Democrats had a very good local election. I think most people would agree. Could you tell us a little bit about from the Lib Dems point of view, what the local elections, how it came across the Lib Dems?
Yeah, we had an amazing local election results, and we in this particular round of councillors being elected in England, we actually elected more councillors than the Conservatives, which is incredible for a party government. In fact, the last time that this happened was 1996. Again, looking at the parallels here, massive swing around the corner. So it was a great election for us, building on successes. Amazing results for the last few years. So the party has grown and grown, particularly in the southwest and the southeast. There's definitely a geographic divide there, and clearly we talk a lot about the blue wall of Lib Dem circles and the seats we're trying to win off the Conservatives. Many of these seats, which are currently held by cabinet members, Jeremy Hunt, for example, all now controlled by Lib Dems, either Lib Dem majority councils or councils that are hung, that are Lib Dem run in some sort of coalition or confidence and supply. So it was an amazing result in that regard. Clearly, much more numbers than Labour, but very, very promising numbers. Adding another 2 councils to our group, 104 extra councillors. So we are very happy about it. We had obviously a very Lib Dem photo op afterwards with dinosaur suits being deployed to actually show the fact that the sort of dinosaurs about to be made extinct. So the party got quite excited in that regard. But no, it is an exciting time to be a Lib Dem councillor, particularly if you are in a Conservative facing area. And I think if you're trying to look at the parallels there and kind of flip that into a Welsh perspective, clearly we're thinking about Brecon Benchdale and Cwm Tawel. Yes, obviously it is an expanded seat. Yes, into an area that was previously part of a safe Labour territory. So, not saying this is going to be easy, but actually all the polls now seem to be suggesting that seat should turn Lib Dem. We've got a hard-working candidate there, a great team, and we can see those similar parallels in that seat to we're seeing in the parts of England in the southwest and southeast. So, very exciting.
if you'll permit me, it's quite nice to be able to read the people using the hashtag #LibDemFightback tag in a non-ironic way for the first time in a long time. So that's great. Lila, do you have some thoughts on this?
Yes, but not along the same lines. I accept everything that our two experts in their respective parties' performances have said, of course, and it's all very impressive. But less so when you think about when it's happening. You know, if that was not how things had gone a few days ago, your parties and the country would be facing a very difficult situation. It was very heartening for me to see the Greens doing very well. Bristol, it's the biggest party, if I remember correctly, although it hasn't got a majority. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of coalition can be agreed. And I am absolutely open personally to the idea of coalitions. I think it's really democracy at work, where people have to actually talk about what their real priorities are and how they can achieve them. That's one thing. The other, if you like, the downside or the opposite side is to see the more extreme right-wing parties doing less well than they had expected and many people expected. Reform obviously must have attracted a lot of votes from the Conservative Party. It didn't do particularly well in terms of seats, which was also quite promising, because if that's typical, then perhaps we've been hearing a lot of noise, and the likes of Suella Braverman have been pushing for a more extreme right-wing position from the current Prime Minister. But the results in those local elections don't back her in that argument.
I completely agree with Lila really on that as well. It's very interesting to see that, especially on those parties of the far right. I think Reform only picked up 2 seats
like that
across the whole of the UK. And I think one of my favourite results of the entire weekend was seeing Count Binface in London beat Britain First. I think we can all, share a sigh of relief that our intergalactic comrade Count Binface has beaten Britain First.
Yeah, can't wait for him to pick up a second home in Pembrokeshire so that he can stand in elections in Wales. Dream candidate guest on the pod. That. Sorry, Joe, you were saying.
On the issue of reform, just quickly, there was a lot of hype about reform making breakthroughs, and I think many of us, I'm sure this is the case for you, Matt, as well, across all parts of Wales would find it frustrating how much attention reform got. Was in the end they got 2 seats, and actually when you watch the coverage, when you watched and read the coverage by the BBC, ITV, the newspaper coverage, it was all even looking at results, it was talking about swings towards reform, and yet actually barely any mention of the Greens and actually very little mention of the Lib Dems. So I think there is that risk of the media bigging up reform in a way that is unnecessary. That they clearly haven't delivered in this election. Yes, they didn't stand in that many places, but where they stood, it was not that significant. Obviously, the reform, I suppose, dynamic is wrecking elections for the Conservatives, which if you're not a Conservative, that's obviously might be quite a nice thing. But obviously, for our democracy, having wrecking ball parties that we've seen in Wales before, when we had UKIP, them and splitting various ways and becoming abolish and UKIP and reform. If those parties ever do get into our parliaments, it is a wrecking ball tactic and isn't healthy for any part of our democracy. So, but thankfully, the results have shown that people at the moment, anyway, do not buy into that argument that reform is a vote worth making. So, have to see how that.
Rich, what are your thoughts? Because you've been asking us questions, but I'm very keen to hear with you.
I don't have a great deal to add other than I joked about it at the start, and I think there continues to be a big issue with the way that the state broadcaster covers local elections and elections across the UK. It was incredibly depressing to find these local elections being described as England and Wales elections across the media landscape. And it continues to, it just perpetuates this kind of problem about England and the fact that nobody ever wants to talk about England as a nation that has its own discrete politics inside the Union. And I just think that's incredibly unhelpful. And that the BBC, of all people, I'm a huge fan of the BBC, big fan of public service media organisations. The fact that BBC cannot get this fairly basic thing right sort of just indicates that there's a sort of entrenched problem in the way that the BBC continues operating. And I don't buy into it. It's not a conspiracy. I don't buy it's a conspiracy. It's either part determinism or it's just a mistake by somebody. But the idea that the foremost media organisation, the one paid for by us as taxpayers in the UK, can't get these things right, what hope do the public have if the BBC can't do it?
I think we're going to move on to a different election, and that is a historic one, actually. So we're recording this episode on the 25th anniversary of the first devolved election in Wales. It took place on this date in 1999. Lila, what would you describe as being the impact of devolution on Wales?
That's a really tough question to answer. I'd love to be able to say that it has made changes in X, Y, and Z. And it has, but they have fallen so far short of hopes, if not expectations, back in 1999. So maybe an occasional listener who remembers that I was working in the Assembly from the very beginning, literally from the day it first met. It became clear quite quickly that the people, the hopes that politicians who'd been elected had to be able to take meaningful steps were quickly shattered. They were quickly reminded that something was or wasn't devolved. Sometimes they were told it's not devolved, and it was. You weren't supposed to touch anything beyond the borders of Wales in terms of discussions in the chamber. They had to become quite, or we had to become quite innovative, creative about finding ways around that and a number of other problems. There was quite a lot of cooperation between the parties actually at the time, which was really interesting and quite creative in its own way too. But that changed when they reverted to the Westminster system. However, the real question is, what difference has it made to Wales? And I'm afraid that I'm going to have to say again, disappointingly little, except in people's perspectives. I think there is a greater feeling of being Welsh and not being ashamed of that than there was when I first came to Wales, which was admittedly a long time ago. The external signs, the physical external signs are quite common. You know, you see Welsh and you hear Welsh being used much, much more widely than it used to be. You see the flags, etc. Not that I'm a fan of flags, but nevertheless, they indicate something about how people are thinking and what they might be open to if there were people of sufficient caliber and courage, and enough of them, to push for meaningful policies. And of course, I'm a policy geek much more than a voting numbers kind of geek, much as I enjoy a good election count. So while we've been talking about local elections, PCCs and so on, I've been sort of vaguely worrying about whether what we've got just has to be much more ruthlessly changed than many people would like to do. There are vested interests. There are people, as has been hinted at, within parties who are very happy with the status quo, very comfortable with it. But let's take the local level, for example. We've been, as we've just touched on, local elections in England. Wales has a very high number of locally elected representatives for its size. Comparing it with Ireland, it's a bit ridiculous. And I'm not going to say one's better than the other or one's worse than the other, but I do wonder whether it actually makes a lot of difference to the quality of democracy. I'm a bit of a fan, for example, of really properly run citizens' assemblies, which have had real impact in Ireland. But they're done in a way there that is very thorough and which has brought forward, has given plenty of evidence that participants in the assemblies themselves have been able to recount the journey towards changing their minds. And this is reflected sometimes in the journey made by the voting population. If you take everyone into account, there's about 8,000 local representatives in Wales. It's a bit over the top, perhaps. And while that might be the equivalent of citizens' assemblies, which is why I mentioned citizens' assemblies, in that it ought to be the forum for real local democracy and for people to have the real discussions, and that matter to their own localities. I'm not sure it does. When there have been efforts in the Assembly, Parliament, as it now is, to make changes to local democracy, and there have been a number of very reasonable efforts, not that dramatically devastating for the population of elected representatives. It's been a disaster. It just hasn't happened. So why? Is it just that people enjoy their experience of being in elected forums, and or what is it? You know, why do they not really engage with the deeper? There's, I could go on and on and on, but I think you get the message that I am really concerned that what we have in terms of local democracy in Wales isn't quite what is needed to support and work with the Senedd and the Welsh Government in order to bring about those really meaningful changes, to implement really meaningful policies. The 20 miles per hour fiasco. I mean, I thought Lee Waters was very brave to do it, and I thought he was very brave to stand up in the Senedd and talk about his disquiet about some things he was being asked to support. Might have been done better, but it is really a strange situation to be in, that all the fury and all the fervour is going into something that actually against something that can save lives, and about something which is comparatively marginal in terms of what Wales really needs to do.
Joe, I think we need to let the elected representative come back in there in terms of how Wales functions in its electoral systems. Do you want to have any comments on that?
Yes, of course. Well, I mean, I think I'm a more optimistic perception than Lila on this. So, I mean, when you think that, you know, we have a whole generation of people, multiple generations of people, be going through our school systems, growing up, only knowing we have a Welsh Parliament, not knowing a world of a Welsh office and the John Redwood times, etc. You know, and that we've come a long way. And I think when I reflect on that first election, and possibly some of the issues around disenchantment after that, is in all of the compromises and concessions within the Labour Party ultimately, which led to our assembly being created with so little powers. And yet we then went into election with parties obviously promising the earth and trying to, you know, present themselves as what they wanted to do for Wales, in reality not being able to do an awful lot of that. And there was a lot of hope in all four parties about what could be achieved. And actually within the considering that we only had secondary legislation for powers, an awful lot was done in that first term. You know, really kind of stretching the limits of what could be done by those sorts of powers. Was it as significant as what happened in Scotland in that first term? No, but we didn't have the powers to do so. So I think that system we were locked into was clearly going to build disenchantment. I mean, in terms of, I suppose, thinking as time's gone on, you know, as we gradually gained more and more powers, you know, it's still a two-legged stool rather than a one-legged stool at the start. But to coin a term that I've heard on this great podcast before, thank you, Richard. You know, we have got better, but ultimately, well, you know, it's only down to the ambition of what parties are willing to do and what people are willing to vote for, and the public have voted parties on manifestos, which are in the case of Welsh Labour, being delivered. And if those policies are not radical enough, that ultimately comes down to, I suppose, the ambition within that party to put forward more ambitious policies and the electorate to actually want to support them. So, you know, when you think about a whole across all sectors, be it agricultural, be it education, be it the health system, we have gone a different path to England and Scotland and Northern Ireland. We are it might not necessarily be radical as everyone might like, but actually when I compare the new curriculum that my children are looking at versus what family members based in England might be looking at the traditional model there, you know, things are different. Our health system is different for better or worse. You know, and we've seen issues with the farming, you know, protests because of differences there. So we are doing different things, but ultimately people always want, you know, radical policies when it comes to them. But a democracy, I suppose, is about making compromises and actually having to bring the whole population with you, which is something obviously that Keir Starmer's now finding out from a UK Labour point of view. That actually we're seeing policies being jettisoned left, right, and centre in order to try and build that big tent to win that majority. So, but that leaves people frustrated, and when things are not as radical as you might like.
Rich, do you think we've got to this stage where devolution is entrenched, or do you think that there is still quite a real risk of abolition?
I really admire, and actually sentimentally, I would like to associate myself with the optimism of Joe's comments. I don't think it's so easy to criticise the Senedd and the idea of there being a Welsh democracy. And I can't remember where it comes from, but there was a metaphor that was used, I think, by John Gower, I think in the early days, about the devolution models in Wales and Scotland. And in Scotland, it was like a bridge that had already been built, and the devolution was the keystone in the top of the bridge that held the bridge together. Whereas in Wales, they were literally just building the foundations of the bridge with the original Senedd. And actually, we've had to build up everything since, and we're still waiting for it to be finished in many ways. And, particularly, again, thinking of what Joe's just said, the Lib Dem position, which I think is now sort of the Labour position, which is that the UK is a federation of nations, and we're slowly moving towards the point at which we have some kind of more robust intergovernmental processes. And post-Brexit, a lot of this was brought into the sunlight. It all kind of shriveled up horribly, and now hopefully we've got some green shoots of something good growing again there. I mean, fundamentally, all devolution settlements will be under threat by parties of whatever flavour until, in law, it says that the Convention of UK Parliamentary Sovereignty no longer exists. We can perhaps comfort ourselves by thinking that no party in 25 years has touched devolution, but what we have seen in the last few years, certainly since Brexit, is UK governments overruling and intervening in what were previously untouched devolved matters. The Sewell Convention, which the Labour Party is promising to address, and it's very easy to do that for the Labour Party with regards to Wales. But if the SNP continue to win in Scotland, then the Labour Party will feel less inclined to entrench the Sewell Convention, and less so even further to think about updating things like the Internal Market Act. Things might be different if we had a Labour Party or Labour-led administrations in England, Wales and Scotland after the next union and devolved elections, but let's see what happens.
The Sewell Convention is already on the statute book, though, Rich. It's already law. It's gone beyond convention. The problem, of course, like you said, is parliamentary sovereignty. And even if Parliament legislated to remove its sovereignty, because Parliament is sovereign, it could just legislate to get rid of that convention. And so around...
Yeah, I mean, you can legislate to, that Rwanda is a safe country because you make a law that says Rwanda is a safe country. I mean, hey, great, isn't it? As Caroline Jones, former First Minister, said to us on the pod, it was created by someone called Dicey, and it itself is a pretty dicey way to operate in a parliament, isn't it? There we go. Joe.
The worry, I suppose, is the way that the Welsh Conservatives want to kind of play the next election, and ultimately, and the one after that. What we obviously, I think, all desire is, across parties, is a situation where parties are standing for election and they want to stand to actually to form the next government, which is obviously great. It's the ideal, but the worry obviously is that a future Welsh Conservative Party leadership might say, actually, no, they want to campaign very much on in a blocking, undermining position, essentially trying to steal the kind of the colours of abolish or reform. And I think that's the worry. And we don't see that. We don't really see that in Scotland in the same sort of way. Generally, the Senedd group and our elected members are very good, actually, at keeping within the realms of of normal legitimate politics. But you see that on the outside. You see that coming from MPs within that party and people from England, very much taken that view that, well, we're never going to win Wales, therefore it's all about opposing Welsh government opposing government and devolution. And I think that is the worry. And I think the worry of what might happen if we have a populist push, which solidifies around abolish stroke reform, and what that means again if we have another wrecking block like we did with UKIP. And it was a very small group ultimately, but it was a group that caused a lot of damage, undermined our institution, abused a lot of public money in the process, was added nothing to our democracy. And I think that's the kind of thing that risks undermining our democracy here. And I often find it interesting that if you look at the populist right in America, it's all very much about undermining the federal government all around the states. And actually, they're never calling for the abolition of Connecticut or the abolition of a state. But actually, in the UK, it's all very much around the populist right wants to solidify everything upwards, up to Westminster, and actually, seems to want to attack the institutions of devolution. So I think we have to be on our guard for that.
I don't think that's necessarily true of all the Conservative group, and I think that there are some interesting new voices, particularly in the newer members of the group, that perhaps aren't so interested in that. But that situation may change when it's a Keir Starmer-led UK government, because they might be somewhat less enthusiastic about re-empowering a Labour administration at that level. But let's see what happens. I suppose the one thing, just to sort of wrap up on the potential for Wales elections. I mean, one of the things that we talked about earlier was there was an interesting piece in The Spectator a little while ago about how Wales could actually be potentially a base for electoral base for these parties in the future, in the same way that we saw with UKIP, because there is a good proportion of voters who lean that way in Wales, and quite rightfully they should have people who represent their views and have their choice at the ballot box. But is that viable? Are we likely to see reform represented in the Senedd in the future, Matthew, particularly in the expanded Senedd?
Yeah, so I've done a lot of work modelling what a potential 96-member Senedd could look like. And obviously this is based on a range of what-ifs, essentially. So obviously universal swing polling is not ideal. It produces odd results. Also, the parties of the contrarian right, your reforms, your abolishes, your so on and so on and so on, will either take votes off each other, or because they hate the institution in and of itself, won't turn out to vote in what they consider a second-tier election. But if they did, and if they didn't take votes off each other, most of the modelling I've done shows Reform getting between 4 and 8 seats in the next Senedd and a 96-member Senedd. Again, that's a projection rather than a prediction. My prediction is that you probably won't see it happen, or if you do, it will be a couple. But if those seats didn't go to Reform, they probably would go to the Conservatives. So it is the Conservatives that are hampered somewhat by a number of Reform people being elected to the next Senedd. It would take seats off the Conservatives primarily. I can tell Joe's thinking about this now in terms of what does it mean for the Lib Dems, and unfortunately for the Lib Dems, most of the models I've done show the Lib Dems getting 1. I have had one version of the model where they got 4, but usually coming behind Reform in terms of seats. The issue with this next set of elections for the Senedd, if this legislation passes, which it very likely will do at some point this week, and again, depending on the seat combinations, which is a bit unknown, and I've tried to use my best guesses and blah, 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 blah. The biggest problem for smaller parties in this election is that whilst there is no legal threshold for election, the actual threshold is very, very high. On the modelling I've done, around 12%. Now, most proportional systems in Europe have a threshold around 5%. Which shows you just how much this system favours the larger parties in Wales. It is very beneficial for the Labour Party. It is very beneficial for Plaid Cymru and the Conservatives. Now, to put this in a little bit more context, I have had more versions of this model showing Labour with a majority than I have with the Greens winning a seat. That kind of gives you some indication about what this system could look like when it's eventually implemented for the next Senedd election.
Yeah, just wondering if I could ask you a little more about that, because I sort of suspected that the closed list system might have been designed to ensure that there could be very little variation on current balance of power. But it seems particularly extreme to think that the Greens might, or the Lib Dems would get so few. Could you tell us a little bit more about both what you think of the closed list system and how you're getting those numbers?
So in terms of my own personal view of the closed list system, I'm not the biggest fan. I think it's well on record that I would have preferred an STV system. Do I think it is a necessary compromise in order to have an expanded Senedd, which I think we all think is necessary for the benefit of scrutiny and for our democracy? Yes. That's fundamentally my position on electoral reform in Wales. I think it's not perfect, but it's a compromise. It was always going to be a compromise with a system that required a supermajority in the Senedd.
And if I may, the problem for the smaller parties, and I mean that not in a slight way, but thinking specifically about the Greens and to a degree the Lib Dems, and also the party we talked about, Reform, etc. Yeah, the challenge comes in the doubling or the pairing of constituencies. So if you think about where you have concentration of votes in a constituency or in a smaller region, then you could, for example, see a Green threshold rising above that 12% or even reaching higher than that in very small areas. But when you think about the geographical size of these combined constituencies, I mean, it's really difficult to see any of those regions where these smaller parties get above that vote. And thinking about the Lib Dems, for example, you can imagine a circumstance where the Maldwyn and Glyndŵr seat was paired with Brecon, Radnor and Cwm Tawel. You'd think, hey, that's bound to return enough Lib Dems to get above that threshold, but they're not going to be paired that way because, unfortunately, the way that the map works out, they're probably going to be paired east-west rather than north-south, which means that the Lib Dems in Montgomeryshire will be paired with Dwyfor Meirionnydd, or whatever that's called in the new thing, and so you're going to probably have a heavy Plaid, and you probably get Conservative and Labour taking the other two, and that's just a big issue for the way it works, and who knows how long this particular map will last. One suspects only one election.
Yeah, I think that's a fair reflection, and I mean we have no idea what the pair is going to be, and I mean clearly it's just require much imagination to see that as a party we will be looking at whatever pairing links to Brecon and Cwm Tawel clearly. And as we've seen in recent polls with Montgomeryshire and Glyndŵr, they're nowhere near as good as the old Montgomeryshire used to be. Looking at the current Labour numbers coming out of those pollings, so we'll have to see. But the threshold is quite high. I think, but the benefit that my party would have, I suppose, over the Greens, for example, and Reform, is the fact that we are very good at having a locally focused vote, and actually when we look at the English local elections, that's very clear in terms of not universal swing at all. We have big clusters, so that's but it's a very high threshold. But we will obviously work with that democratic system and see what happens. We have absolutely no idea what's going to happen to the Labour vote after a UK general election is won by the Labour Party. And whilst we cannot assume we'll have 1999 again, but we don't know what that's going to be. I mean, clearly the Welsh Conservatives are thinking a lot of their campaigning, their populist campaigning at the moment, one would argue, is not making any impact on the UK general election. But clearly it is storing up potential supporters for a Senedd election. People who are signing petitions, who are getting involved, who might actually be on a database which could be utilised for a Senedd election in a revitalised Welsh Conservative Party. I think that's clearly a gamble being taken there. So, and equally, I have no idea how Plaid will respond to a UK-led Labour government. So Labour-led UK government. So I think it's all to play for, but it is a very high threshold. And that might be, I suppose, a saving grace in terms of keeping out the extremist parties on the right. Actually, particularly if there are multiple ones, the idea of them hitting 11, 12% anywhere seems quite hard to imagine. But that does create challenges for other parties as well.
One more thing before we leave this for that I just wanted to get on to, Rich, is that the examples that you see in European nations where they move from this sort of first past the post to a more proportional system is that for the first election, at least, people tend to vote like it's first past the post, and then they sort of work it out. But that wouldn't be beneficial to the Greens at all, because in Wales, historically, they've done much better on the lists than they have in constituency voting. They tend to be a lot of people's second choice. Just, the same with lots of other parties. Take South Wales Central, for example, Lib Dems or Plaid or the Greens always do well as people who are Labour's second choice. So I think this new system is very bad for parties like the Greens, because as we know, this new system, you won't get multiple options. You'll get one ballot paper, and the choice of one party. People won't be able to reward their second choice with this top-up system. That's not to say in the future it may not be beneficial for the Greens when people work out this system a bit later down the line. But from all the maths and models I've done, and from all the European examples that I've looked at, I can't see it being very beneficial for those small parties.
So we are running over time, but we can't let the pod pass without, as we're touring Great Britain, we might as well stop briefly at Scotland. Just invite our guests to make a comment or two about situations north of the border and what is happening with the SNP government there, and also the other parties, if we have some insight in that regard. So maybe could I invite you, Lila, first, and then we'll go to Joe.
I'll bring my historian mentality to it a little bit. You know, parties have ups and downs. This SNP has been the lead party in Scotland for quite a long time in political terms, and it's had problems that they couldn't, even the best of their politicians could not have foreseen. On the other hand, John Swinney is probably the safe pair of hands that they need to steady the ship at the moment, and it doesn't look as if independence per se has fallen down the popularity stakes. So they do have something on which to work, ground on which to rebuild. So I could foresee, if Labour puts a lot of work into it, that the next UK general election could see them definitely falling from considerably from their current number of MPs, but probably not nearly as far as they were before the rise began not very long ago. So yeah, it's one of those moments for the SNP in this case, and happens if you look around the world. But that happens to parties, even though they seem to be impossible to shift for 10, 15 years. The SNP is going through a bad patch. It won't come out of it fast, but it's probably not as bad as a lot of the discussion on UK media and social media is suggesting.
Certainly a bit of wish casting there, isn't there, from some parts of the press at the moment. Joe, do you have any insight, particularly, I don't know, about your party's own position in Scotland at the moment, or just general comments about the situation that the Scots find themselves in?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fascinating situation to be in. I think it's seeing this slow-moving implosion of the SNP has been interesting to watch, and as Leda said, it is very much I suppose about time in terms of the political cycle. I think what I found fascinating, I was at the last Scottish Labour conference with a different hat on, and actually the excitement and energy around the conference was clear, and it wasn't a sort of a UK Labour Keir Starmer led excitement. It was about Anas Sarwar. There was a lot of excitement around him, around him as a next First Minister, around the MSP group. Actually, we saw very little profile for parliamentary candidates for the UK general election. They were quite hard to identify, to be honest. But actually, a lot of excitement about forming the next Scottish government, and that being a Labour government there. So I think that is very exciting. I think the Conservatives are showing the read there, but clearly the opinion poll is not looking great for them for a UK general election. Clearly, yes, the Scottish Democrats are optimistic in certain areas, but although some of those once great heartlands have been overrun by the SNP and now sort of SNP conservative areas, sadly. But there will certainly potential for a number of gains there. But it is very much Labour's for the taking, and I think there's a lot of excitement there around Anas and around that group. So watch this space.
Matthew.
So for what it's worth, Rich, obviously I know more about Welsh Labour than I do the Scottish Party, but I think there is a broad consensus that the Labour Party are going to do quite well in Scotland at the next general election, probably win the 20-25 seat kind of mark. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Scottish Labour will be the next party of government in Holyrood. I think there's a general belief that some people in Scotland have been voting SNP because and for independence because they feel that that is the best way to ensure that Conservatives don't have a rule over their life. But presented with the option of potentially actually voting for a Labour government at a UK level, that will rid them of Tory rule. They'd be quite happy to do so. But much like we will see in 2026, it is significantly easier to run an election campaign when you're not the incumbent party at a Westminster level. So that may be an issue for Welsh Labour. We'll see. I hope not. But again, it could be a very difficult election for Scottish Labour in 2026 if they're trying to push the SNP out of government and from their very strong position. If they have to be the incumbent party of the UK Labour, making potentially, I think, will be wonderful decisions, but could be potentially unpopular decisions. But again, we'll have to actually see how John Swinney can keep the government, the SNP's governments together in Scotland at the minute because of what happened with the Green Party. Maybe he's made some sort of agreement with either Ash Regan or with the Green MSPs in order to ensure that his government can pass votes. But we have to remember they are one seat short of a majority in Scotland. So, well, actually, they're 2 seats short of a majority in Scotland. They are actually theoretically able to be no confidence, which is what got rid of Humza Yousaf in the first place. So it's going to be very interesting to see what kind of impact John Swinney can have in the next little bit of time before the UK parliamentary and the Scottish parliamentary elections, to see how effective the SNP can actually be, because that would be the biggest damage, potential damage for them, is if they be perceived to be ineffectual in the next couple of years before an election.
Yeah, it certainly feels like the days of running, the SNP running a minority administration, as Alex Salmond did, seem pretty, getting votes from the Conservatives, etc., to get things through. Seems like a different era. So we're coming to the end of the pod, and I'm going to introduce a whole new section just to wrap up, which I'm going to improvise the title as AOB, which we'll all be familiar with. Is there something from the last week or so, or month or so, that you all think that we should be keeping an eye on, folks? Joe, I wonder if I can drop this. I'm not allowed to call it a bomb. I wonder if I can drop this bombshell. No, I'm not going to do that either. I dropped this surprise on your lap. That also sounds weird. I'm just gonna say, Joe, over to you.
Okay, that's well, I think there's still a lot of uncertainty to come out of the Welsh Labour leadership campaign and the issue around the money. I think that the UK press, particularly the right-wing press, is starting to show an interest in it after having largely ignored it during, which I think is part of the kind of low-profile Wales gets. I think clearly there are there's been some suggestions about actually about the money has to be given back, and I thought Will Hayward gave an interesting kind of expose talking about the issues around there not being, which I didn't realise, not being a Welsh Labour bank account, and so therefore how does that even work? Which was news to me. So I think that has the potential of undermining trust in this government, for at least for the time being. But I'm sure that our new First Minister will get past it. But it's not a great start. But yes, I think that seeing how that rumbles over the next few months, I think will be interesting. But will it impact the UK general election? No. And I think by the time we get to the next Senedd campaign, it'll be way in the past, I would have thought. But it does undermine trust in politics slightly. And I think how it's been perceived by certain members of the Labour Senedd group, clearly shows their own worries about it, because it doesn't look great.
Yeah, thank you for that. So, Lila, do you have something?
I would have gone with the same topic, but other than that, I've been looking beyond the borders of Wales rather more than within them in recent times. One item which you may or may not have seen covered here is the spat between the Republic of Ireland and the London government about immigrants. It was the unmentionable word, a great shock when Ireland's Justice Minister announced a couple of weeks ago that as many as 80% of people turning up in Dublin looking for what is correctly termed international protection, but usually called as asylum seekers, were coming across the border from Northern Ireland. It was not surprising when you think about it, because even if the individuals concerned hadn't discovered for themselves that there was an open border between a bit of the UK and a seemingly friendly country, part of the EU, then they're the people who are trafficking them, making money out of migrant movements, would certainly have spotted that. whatever the reason, it's there. Ireland is faced with a huge problem trying to accommodate them. And that comes parallel with the rise of racism that I didn't predict in my book. Although I admitted in the launch that that it was one of the things I missed, but nobody would have predicted. However, the background to that is that it has to do with UK politics. Nigel Farage took an interest in Irish politics just as soon as he got the Brexit referendum done and dusted, started going over. It is being alleged on social media with all the care one must take with saying that money is reaching some of the far right in Ireland, that just as happened in Britain. On social media, there's clear unity of opinion between the racists in Ireland and those on this island. You see the likes of Britain First congratulating them on the latest place they've tried to burn down. And it's pretty nasty. And I think that's very nasty. Let's not try to be polite about this. Is it something that will or won't show up in the local elections and the European elections that will take place on the 7th of June? That remains to be seen. But with much as I like the single transferable vote form of proportional representation, yeah, it'd be very sad to see Ireland being represented in Europe, for example, by people like Farage did Britain just a few years ago. But more importantly, the impact on actual people, whether local or immigrant, is quite a shock.
Thank you for that. Matthew?
You know, it's interesting for us energy whisperers, those people who are really interested in what's going on with the Welsh energy scene. But I don't know if anybody has seen this story that Traws-Fynydd has been ruled out as a potential site for a future GB nuclear location. So Great British Nuclear, the company set up by the UK government a few years ago, basically to proliferate, I think is unfortunately the correct word, more nuclear sites in Wales in order to hit our net zero targets. I'm not going to offer a view on nuclear energy at this point. You can go and listen to our wonderful two-part episode series between Rachel Garrick and Maverick Gwynfor, discussing the pros and cons of nuclear. Getting that plug in for you, Rich, don't worry. But the one interesting thing about it is it has led there to being some sort of question about whether there's politics behind the decision. With local Plaid Cymru MP Liz Saville-Roberts claiming that GB Nuclear is favouring an Ynys Môn site, obviously, because the Conservatives are defending Ynys Môn in an upcoming general election, and that is also a very quote-unquote good site for nuclear. It's a slightly larger site at Orfa that could potentially be used to generate nuclear energy. So one to watch as we approach a general election, I think that. What about you, Rich? What's your AOB?
Thank you. So mine is completely different, 100% different. I am going to plug a Substack, not our own, but that of future Hiraeth guest, Leighton Andrews. Leighton Andrews, former Welsh Government minister, who lost his seat in the Senedd to Leanne Wood when she won the Rhondda seats in 2016. He has started a Substack, which is a part of his research for an upcoming book called Governing Wales. And he is going through the minutes of the early Welsh government. He's starting in the year 2000 from that's the earliest minutes that are available. And it's quite fascinating to get a read about what was the dominant thought at the time and what was the history behind some of the decisions that were made. And Joe will appreciate this. I particularly enjoyed reading the first newsletter that he sent around, where they have members of the early, what were they called, assembly secretaries quitting the cabinet because of the sheer incompatibility of having Lib Dems in the cabinet in that first Rhodri Morgan-led coalition. I mean, just generally quite fascinating, because we pride ourselves, or have prided ourselves in recent years, about the collaborative nature of the Welsh Parliament as it is now, and Welsh Government having been coalitions on a number of occasions. But yes, it's kind of fascinating to read some of the fury amongst Labour members when that first Labour Liberal Democrats government emerged under Rhodri Morgan. Yeah, it's quite an insight for people that have no direct memory of that time.
Well, I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you very much to our wonderful guests, Joe Carter and Leather Haynes.
Thank you.
Much. If people want to hear more from you online, where can they go and find you? For example, say on X/Twitter, Joe.
So Twitter's probably best for me. So slash Joseph _ Carter UK is my handle.
Lila.
And for me, it's at Lila Eilish. I'll spell that Lilaeilis. Eilish is the Irish for Elizabeth.
Thank you. Rich, what about you, sir?
Yep, I'm still there at Mimosa Cymru. And just to reassure Lila, we will also put a link to buy her book.
It's a fantastic read. Everyone should read that book, or read it and go back and listen to the pod we did with Lila a few years ago. Fascinating listen. You can find me if you want to hear any more of my ramblings at Hexter101 on all the socials. But again, thank you so much for listening tonight. If you like what you hear, you can go find Hiraeth on all the socials at HiraethPod. You can go to our website, www.walespolitics.com. And thank you so much for supporting us with your ears. But if you would like to do so with your wallet, you can go to www.patreon.com/HiraethPod. Thank you for listening to Hiraeth. If you like what you heard, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review.